Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC EduSet live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on Indian writing in English, today we would be talking on a very interesting topic. The topic is Macaulay's Minute, a crucial document. And for this very discussion, we have once again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is contributing a lot in this series, and every time through him we are getting immense knowledge. So dear friends, let's welcome our guest Professor Anand Prakash, and let's try to understand more and more about the topic Macaulay's Minute, a crucial document. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, for your kind words, and welcome viewers to this very important discussion in the 19th century about the role of literature, the role of language in a country, and the significance of language in the governance of a country from outside. I'll be discussing at some length Macaulay's Minute. It's a document. Its length would be about 20 pages, 20 printed pages. And this document was presented to the British government, and a strong case was argued by Macaulay against the funding of learning in India with respect to the Indian languages such as Arabic and Sanskrit, both of which were the classical languages behind the dialects, behind other languages that were spoken in the 19th century. There is a history to this document. I'll come to the history later, but then one has to bear in mind the fact that this document was presented to the British Parliament, and it was recommended and sent from here by the Governor General, Lord Bentinck. And this document was prepared in sometime in the 1830s, and it was presented in 1835. So it is called Macaulay's Minute, the 1835 document. And it follows the debating mode. There are certain points that the writer is making, and he is bringing them in the discussion in a rhetorical manner. He wants to drive home the point. He wants not merely to argue, but also to propagate a particular point of view in the first half of the 19th century, and he has to make a case. Let me also tell you that Macaulay, T.B. Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay, was a bureaucrat, and he was in the education ministry, and he had worked hard before he could present this document. He marshals arguments from Indian languages. He also speaks at length about the European language and culture structure. He refers to England and Europe consistently in this document, and he is clear in his argument that Indians should be funded keeping in mind the interests of the British. So if the British interests are not looked after in the funding part, in the policies of the British interests, then of course that funding is to be reviewed. So that's the case. It's an economic case. It's an ideological case. It's also a language-centered or culture-centered case, and it's very important. The importance of this document can be gauged by the fact that after it was presented and adopted, the language that was a foreign language till then, English, became gradually a part of the Indian culture, Indian practice, Indian cultural practice, and it went then of course beyond that. So it's a turning point. This document marks the turning point of the policies that the British adopted vis-a-vis India, and in the context of adoption of a language which would be then used by the British regime. So it's that kind of crucial document, and let's look at a few arguments that the author Macaulay is forwarding in this document. He is very formal. He uses all the legalese, all the bureaucraties. His jargon is very elaborate, and the sentences are long, and sometimes there are double negatives. So one has to think about the sentence twice before one can find out whether he is for or against a particular thing. And when I was taking just a few notes from this document, then I realized that one has to be careful regarding what he is saying, because he has to carry a conviction with people who might disagree with him. And he also is aware in this document that a debate is going on in the English circles in India, as well as the India connected circle in the West and in England. He knows all this, and he's speaking against that background. So we should try to see the nuances that he's bringing in the course of his argument, and then he has to prove his point. So it's a kind of a legal document also, because it's to be considered by the British Parliament, and it should not leave any loopholes. Nobody should be able to catch Macaulay on points of detail. And of course, like all clever arguers and debaters, he knows what to hide and what to reveal. He knows what to play down and what to emphasize, and he does that beautifully. I just give one example. He is going to comment on in the document. He is going to comment on the efficacy of Indian languages with respect to literary expression and scientific information. And when he talks about the Indian languages, he says, I don't know much about them. So if he doesn't know much about them, then how can he talk like an expert? And he talks like an expert then. So the point I am making is that like a true bureaucrat and like a true debater and like a true speaker, he knows what to hide. So he's hiding the fact that he doesn't know much about Indian languages. But then he says, I don't know, but this is true. So this is that usual kind of a trick, usual kind of a tactic that an able debater uses in the course of his presentation. So anyway, this is the minor kind of foreword, a kind of introductory remark that I wanted to make before I take up a few questions that he is raising in this document called Millet. I'm just quoting a few lines from him, some words sometimes, not merely full sentences. For instance, he is talking about literature. By literature, the Parliament can have meant only Arabic and Sanskrit literature. So he's referring to a resolution passed by the British Parliament in 1813, and 22 years later, in 1835, he says that particular bill that was presented and passed as an act by the British Parliament in 1813, that talked about the funding of Indian languages, and there were words used there. And the words, for instance, were the native scholars. And then he says that a parliament at that point of time was only referring to Arabic and Sanskrit literature, and that he finds not very useful now. And then he talks about a learned native. This is the expression used in that particular resolution of 1813, and there is a learned native. And he goes into the definition of who the learned native is. And he says that the learned native cannot be a person who knows Arabic and Sanskrit. Why? He has to give reasons, and then he gives very smart reasons, very clever reasons, anyway, implying that a person who is a native cannot be learned unless this native person has mastered languages from the West. He wants to say this, and he goes round and round, and he is very circumspect, but then finally to himself he is able to prove that nobody who knows Indian languages can be a learned person. Learning comes from the European languages. So right in the beginning, one is clear that the person is biased, and he is biased in favor of the British superiority and against what can be called Indian backwardness. I'm not going into the merits of the case. India at that point of time could not match the tactics, strategies, and the intellectual level of the Britisher in general. There might have been great thinkers and philosophers, as we have been discussing it in the series that we present here. But he is not bothering about that particular person in India who knows wisdom, who has facts also with him, and but the person in his opinion is using Arabic and Sanskrit. So if one has knowledge of Arabic and Sanskrit, by definition that person is not a learned person. This seems to be his definition of this in the beginning itself. Then he talks about funding the Indian learned or the learned Indian only in view of the language that one is pursuing. And it says because Britishers have interests of the Britishers will be served only when the money goes to help the learned. Therefore, one has to review the bill that was passed as an act in the Parliament in 1813. So he wants to reverse that particular bill, wants to criticize it, wants to start rethinking about that bill, so that a new bill is passed, and in this bill learned will be redefined, learned person will be redefined, and funds then will be diverted from the original recipients. In India at that point of time, he also doesn't make any bones. He is very clear about it, and he says that money is being given to people who know Arabic and Sanskrit, and that money, in his opinion, is going waste. So if one has to invest money, if one has to spend money, and the money comes from the British government, then that money should be utilized properly. So utilization is the part that he wants to emphasize again and again. And he says no specific purpose will be served if that money is given to a Sanskrit scholar or to a Arabic scholar, because that scholar will be wasting money on himself and his learning, which is of no use to us. Us means the Britishers. So this is the point with which he starts. Okay, the fund for the purpose of promoting learning in India. So how can you promote learning, says he. How can you promote learning in India if that learning is spent on the knowledge of Sanskrit and Arabic, or knowledge contained in the Sanskrit and Arabic languages? So as an argument, I don't think that this will survive, because knowledge is not restricted to languages, and a person using this or that language can bring in knowledge if that person has it already. But in this case, he seems to be rather insensitive to an individual who has not learned English. So knowledgeable, learned you are only if you know English. And if I use a Baconian method, then one can also say that if you know English, then you have learning. And the second is, if you have learning, then you must be English. So this is the kind of Baconian logic that can be used in order to find out the truth about the statement that Macaulay starts with in the beginning of the document. Then he gives expression to his prejudice still further and in sharper terms when he says this. I quote a sentence here: the dialects commonly spoken among the natives of this part of India. This part of India is the British part of India. This part of India is the Gangetic Plain. This part of India is North India by and large. So the dialects commonly spoken among the natives of this part of India contain neither literary nor scientific information. What a broad and sweeping statement, but he is making it. And let's take him at the face value. So far as he is concerned, Indians do not know much about the literary value or the scientific information, because they are not well versed in a language which contains them. So this seems to be the simple logic that he pursues here. And he is calling Indian languages not languages, but the spoken things, and as spoken things they are dialects. So the languages in India are Arabic and Sanskrit, and all the spoken languages are the dialects. Quite simple. In the 19th century, there may not have been much of printed book. There may not have been much of a number of people who would be writing for publication. There were different other methods. People didn't publish, but then they wrote, and and all kinds of documents exist in India till that time, and starting from much earlier in the previous centuries. And those documents were there in the written form, but they were not published. But here, unless something is published, unless something is formally accepted over a stretch in the country, geographical stretch, it doesn't become a language. So I don't want to go into the difference between a language and a dialect, but then for him, unless something is written and preserved for a long time and it is printed also, it is not a language. So anyway, so he talks about dialects commonly spoken among the natives of this part of India contain neither literary nor scientific information. I don't have to contend this, but then this is the argument on which he will be building certain points, and those points will be relevant to the issue that he is dealing with in this particular document. The next sentence then would be, who would deny that? And then he says, a single shelf of a good European library, mind you, a single shelf, just one Almirah of a European library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Imagine, he is not talking of merely India but also Arabia. So he is going beyond the Indian territories. So neither in Arabia nor in India are books worthy of attention and worthy of reading. So there might be hundreds and thousands and lakhs of books, and over a period of time they would have piled up and accumulated in still larger number. On one side are these books, put them against only a shelf full of books from Europe, and then see the difference. The difference is that the shelf is much more worthy than all the lakhs and millions of books that have been written in India or Arabia. So in India and Arabia is I think a very large chunk of the world, very large chunk of the people who inhabit the world. And if these people have not written any book worth preserving, worth reading, then of course, so far as he is concerned, in his opinion, the effort of the intellectual human effort of this part of the world has gone completely waste. So this is the point he is making, and he's imagine he's presenting it with that kind of a gusto, that kind of a conviction before the British Parliament, and he wants that the policies of the Parliament will be changed according to the suggestions that he is making in this document. Further, even in works of imagination, he is not a man, it seems, from poetry or from novel or fiction or drama. He seems to be a man from at the most education. But then he is talking about scientific education, and therefore literature for him is the work of imagination. Now it's literally it's a work of imagination, but all of us know today, and people knew in the 19th century, there was a huge chunk of literary criticism in the 19th and 18th centuries in England, and which would not agree with this kind of a definition of literature, that it's a work of imagination, because all works are all, even scientific works are works of imagination in some sense, because imagination is a part of the mental process, mental work, and unless the scientist has imagination and then he brings in facts and combines the two, one doesn't go much further in the field of science either. And you would have seen that if you go into the details of this kind of formulation, then scientists only belong to the library, and writers belong only to the realm of imagination. So very, very fine, very simple, very clear, and everybody has to accept. This seems to be the conviction from which he is talking. So he is defining literature as work of imagination. So he says one can't compare Arabic and Sanskrit with languages of great European nations. He is telling us that work of imagination also is not as good in India and in Indian languages as it is there in the languages of the West. Now very cleverly he is hiding English. He is not referring to English here. He is talking about great European nations who have their own languages. So he has brought in, it's a kind of European identity that he is using in order to further his argument. And he says that there is a German language, there is a French language, there is a Russian language also, which is a part of the West to a certain extent. And one is Spanish and all those languages, and English. He doesn't name the specific languages, but then he puts them under the category of the great European nations, which nurture, promote and strengthen their own languages. And he says, if you compare even the works of imagination, you will find that India is lacking much there in comparison with what is happening in great nations. I don't have to contend for this. I think literature, wherever it is produced, is a part of the world culture, and in my opinion. And I think that if something good is written in England or in Europe, also belongs to the reader here, and vice versa. If something good is written in India, then that also is shared by the Indians with the rest of the world. So, but he is comparing. Imagine he is comparing something that can't be compared. Different cultures, different societies, they have their own ways of expressing their emotions, sentiments, and use those forms which are the forms of short story, narration, the epic form, all those things. And within their specificities, there are great points of commonness also. So cultures, languages are not isolated. They all work in a kind of a place where they interact with other languages and cultures. And since he doesn't know the nature of literature, the nature of, in fact, even scientific writing, to the extent that is required for furthering the argument at this level, therefore he is just calling literature the work of imagination. And there he says that what is written in India in the name of literature in the 19th century or in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, that can't be compared with what has been written in the European languages. Now, not that one has to discuss all this, but then of course there are great writers in Europe. One should give full credit to them, and they have the background of Renaissance. And Renaissance brought in the kind of humanism which could not flower and prosper in India. That also is true. So if that literature has excelled itself in Europe, then that's a matter of pride, not just for the Europeans but also for us. On the other hand, see that there are great writers in India. I'm not going to the Bhakti Kal in North India. I'm just referring to the 19th century itself. You have great writers in the Romantics in England, but you also have great writers in India. And if he's talking of Arabic and Sanskrit, then he's downgrading, let's say, dialects, then there is a person called Ghalib in the 19th century, and he's writing in one of the dialects called Urdu, or you call it Hindi, or whatever name, and compare the two, and you find that in many respects, both European and Indian writing comes very close to each other, and the reader, if he knows English or German on one side and Indian languages on the other, then would take equal pleasure in reading Ghalib. And even today, when Ghalib is appreciated in English translation all over the world, and in other languages too he has been translated, then one knows the rather emptiness and vacuity of the argument that this person is forwarding. Viewers, I'm just letting you know what he is saying, plus my comments, because with these comments you can see them in perspective, and where he's in a way blurring the boundaries between definition of a broad kind and the reality of the case. Then he says bounties and premiums such as ought not to be given for the propagation of truth. Well, I would agree with this, that truth cannot sustain itself only on the strength of money. So bounties of money should not be used for propagation of truth. Truth is strong enough to come out and affect human imagination and life. Therefore, one should not fund the propagation of truth unnecessarily. I think he's right there. If the writers, if the thinkers, if the scientists, if people who experiment with processes of nature, if these people have to work hard, then of course they require resources. But then the truth of their effort will not require funding, because this truth is the product of these people's mental work and their imagination. So, but he is saying something different. But he says we lavish on false texts and false philosophy. In the case of India, truth doesn't require any money, but if it requires money, it requires money in the case of those texts and those languages where there is truth. And so far as India is concerned, there is no truth here. And what is the terminology he is using? He is using the term false texts. I, as a neutral observer, as an objective observer, would say that there aren't many books. There may not be a single book, in fact, in India at that point of time, which can be called a scientific tract, a scientific book, a book on science, a book on latest researches about nature and about other things. That can be true, but then calling something a false text and a false philosophy. Now, what is a true philosophy and what is a false philosophy? I think if I look at it objectively, I find that philosophy by definition is something which is not directly connected with reality. Philosophy is a question of morals, it's a question of principles, it's a question of norms. So norms change, morals change, and taste and other things change, priorities change, for instance, values change. So therefore, instead of calling false philosophy and false texts, it doesn't make sense, because philosophy is a domain where mind is at work and principles are being discussed. Nothing factual is being discussed. So what is false? In fact, all philosophy is false from the point of view of scientific discussion. So, but anyway, he's not very particular about the use of words. I don't think use of words in this particular document is a strong point. He doesn't know what he's saying. So when he says false philosophy, then he talks about something which is a true philosophy, and that true philosophy resides somewhere in the European languages. Now, there are philosophical texts in Europe, but those texts also have become stale and outdated with the passage of time. So not that they contain truth, but that they can contain information about morals, norms, and principles. So anyway, this is the tone of the document, and finally, I'll give that particular portion. I'll read it out to you, and I'll then raise the question regarding what actually his aim is. What's his aim of projecting English as a language of India, as a language for India, as a language to be used in India? And then the cat is out of the bag. Then he tells us very clearly as to why he wants English to be propagated in India in such a manner that the state power and the state funds are behind it. And he says this, with this particular, set of sentences that I am quoting to you. And please consider, you make your own opinion, you think about it yourself. If you believe that what I say can be contested, then of course you are free to do that also, here as well as elsewhere. But this is what this person says about the idea of starting a language and making it prosper in another country on the strength of money and funds. Now here the statement is, we must at present do our best to form a class. Now he is forming a class, a group of people, to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. He wants a class. So there are Britishers and there are Indians, and between them there should stand a class of people, and this class should be a bridge between, it should be an interpreter between the Indians and the British. He wants to form this class. Okay, I think he is free to form this class. He has the power. He is a spokesperson of the governing authorities here and elsewhere, and he says, interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, and then he defines it, Indian in blood and color. And I think it requires a kind of discussion. So I'll just read it out, and I can then comment on it in the following discussion. So I'll just read it out. Whom we govern, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class you may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature and things like this. So this is the statement he is making, and it's a policy statement, and this tells us the intent. So here I finish, and it can be taken up later in our discussion. Thank you. The point that is to be made here is whether the Britishers require a group in India. That group will interpret the Indian conditions to them, and that group will interpret the English ideas for the benefit of the Indians. So there should be a group in the middle. It's a kind of a middle class that Britishers will be forming in the 19th century, and this middle class, according to Macaulay, whom we discuss now, Macaulay is suggesting that English will be able to help the Britishers form a class which will be Indians in blood and color, but then they will be a kind of instrument of interpretation between the British and the Indians. Is that the right kind of formulation, friends? Do you think it makes sense? And do you think that you can identify certain areas in India which exemplify, which become examples of this kind of a class, which is Indian in blood and color, but then they are carriers of the norms and values of the Britishers? Well, you can think about it, and as I think about it, I realize that there is indeed a group in this country. I have been a part of this group, all my life. That I'm Indian and in blood and color, and I've been reading English, and I've been interpreting English literature for the benefit of my friends, fellow scholars, and associates. And sometimes I've been talking about India using English for the benefit of the British or the foreign Western reader and viewer. So there's a class in India today, and this class originated historically in the 19th century, and this person is talking directly about the chances of this class coming up and playing a role. And what role will they play? They will play the role of interpreters, and they will be the carriers of the British notions of truth and values. So this class can be formed in India, says Macaulay, with the help of propagation of English as a language. And if funds are released, if policies are made, if those policies are sought to be implemented with both temptation and force, then a language can be started in a country at the level of bureaucracy, at the level of education, at the level of educational bureaucracy and authorities, at the level of opening of schools and making a language compulsory or at least necessary for Indians to pursue, so that they can get jobs on that basis. And finally, the wherewithal, the background of facilities can be provided with that kind of preparation, which involves printing of books, raising of buildings, constructing buildings, appointing the staff, giving the staff facilities to interact with one another, and so that a kind of culture is formed. And then, of course, people are produced in India as members of a class which will be useful for the Britishers in their governance. So this is the policy document that he is presenting, and this is the crux of the matter. So what is there in the middle or in the beginning of the document? That was merely a debate where he was going against the accepted policies of the British regime before this document came into existence, and when it was accepted and finally executed in the public domain. Now, since the document is clear before us, it's a document where Indian languages will be denigrated. It's a document that will popularize the interests of English, establish and make acceptable the superiority of English language and literature in India, in directly through word of mouth as well as through printed word, and more than that, through making Indians read not their own literature but the literature written elsewhere. And since that literature belongs to the governing people, the governing class, therefore it has that force also. So that literature is supposed to be superior to the native literatures. So this is the kind of cultural, ideological, philosophical and political suppression that is going to take place in India through a language which is foreign and in everything, and it brings those norms here, and those norms, maybe if they are humanistic norms, then they'll appeal to us, and if they are norms of superiority, then they'll suppress us. So this is the kind of thing that emerges in the 19th century, and this document seems to be at the center of it. How should we take this document? Should we accept it as truth? Should we accept it as false? Should we go against it? These are the questions, that we will confront as we discuss this document. Now, my idea is that we should be able to. We are a free country today, and we have this, equality to argue and discuss. We should also have the modesty to realize, that we have certain drawbacks, that we have certain weaknesses. But then those drawbacks and weaknesses should make us stronger, because when we know that there are weaknesses and there are drawbacks, then we should try to rectify them. For instance, in the 19th century, it is indeed true that Indian languages do not have the kind of literature which is based on science, which is based on an assessment of facts, an assessment of details and data. But people are coming forward at that time. I'm not going to defend this. I say that so far as the knowledge of science is concerned in India, that seems to be deficient, and that we should take care in the 19th century and today. We should take care to rectify this kind of a thing and enrich ourselves in this particular domain. What about literature? In literature also, we have to be critical of what was written in the 19th century or in the 18th century. And I don't feel at all embarrassed, to say that most of the literature in the previous centuries as well as the 19th century, went by the standards that were set by, certain sections in society. There were sections in India in society, and these sections had their own way of interpreting social life and interpreting, the idea of truth. And that did not sometimes work according to the interests and the requirements of the Indian masses. There are very few, cases where writing is focusing upon the requirements and interests of the Indian masses. Of course, there are writers, and today we cherish only those writers in their writing who thought about the masses. For instance, in the 19th century, before this document appears, there have been poets in Urdu and Hindi in the northern part of which this person is talking, and these writers are keeping in mind the interests of the common masses. There are people like Nazir Akbar Abadi, who writes in the early part of the 19th century, and who is all the time talking about the masses, and because of which his writing is very appealing. But then let's assume that Indian literature at that point of time cannot match with certain parameters which the Western literature has evolved in their body. And the best example is of the English Romantic poetry. English Romantic poetry is so powerful, it's so appealing, that the moment we learn English and we start reading English Romanticism, then we realize that this is how we should write. So there's no harm in accepting the value and the worth of a writing that emerged elsewhere. So I'll say that so far as the facts are concerned, let's accept them. It's a fact that India at that point of time does not have enough knowledge of sciences. Let's accept it as a fact. And there, the knowing of English is going to enrich us a great deal. But this person is talking about prejudices. The prejudice is, that shelf on the one side and the whole books, all the books on the other side, and the shelf is much more. Now, this kind of thing is more prejudiced. It's more of a bias, and I call it imperialist prejudice. I'll come to it, in the course of time and mention it. But there are a few points I want to share, with respect to this document, which I have briefly, outlined, for use in this discussion. The first thing is, what is the background of this document? This document appears in 1835. So, what has been happening in India in the previous decades of the 19th century and the 18th century, like in 1780, 1790, and 1800s, and then 1810 onwards? What is the background? The background is that there is a group of people, and they are called Orientalists, and they have come to India, and they have read Indian classics, and they have strived to translate those documents into English and other European languages, and they are popularizing them, and they are telling the whole world that this is the Eastern literature, this is the Eastern wisdom. I don't think all that is as meritorious as I would like this to be, but there is no doubt that Orientalists were popularizing Indian literature elsewhere, and they were rendering a service to our culture and philosophy. And when these texts of the ancient time, when they were made available in other languages elsewhere, then people felt that thrill, that excitement, and the interest was much more there to know as to how ancient writing in India flourished and flowered. So Orientalism ruled the roost in the previous 30 or 40 years before this document comes into being. This person now is shifting emphasis. Maybe the Britishers now realize that too much of Orientalism might give a sense of identity to the Britishers, and Britishers' cause will be weakened. Maybe that is the case. I don't want to go into the facts of this case, but then because Orientalism is in the air and India's name is spreading elsewhere through European languages, and texts are being more and more translated. So this person is reacting very sharply to the Orientalists. Orientalists talk about the value of the Orient, and this person is talking about the deficiency and the weakness of the Eastern countries. So maybe the pendulum is swinging now on the other side. Earlier it was talking too much of making too much glory in the case of Indian writing, and this person is denigrating it and putting it much lower down than actually may be the case. This is the background, and this background should be kept in mind. So it's a kind of a pendulum going the other side. The second thing is he, Macaulay, that is, product of utilitarianism? England is becoming more and more utilitarian in the first half of the 19th century. What is utilitarianism? Now I'll just speak a few sentences to explain to you what utilitarianism is. Actually, in England in particular and Europe in general, in the first 20-30 years of the 19th century, industrialization has come to the fore. The industrial production was not there, before 1800, but certainly with the invention of steam engine and different new sources of power, big industries started working in Europe and in England in the early years of the 19th century, and with that the number of goods, the production of goods that increased on a big scale, and then they required markets, and then industry had to be recognized as something useful, and for that a philosophy emerged, and that philosophy was of utilitarianism, that you will now produce in order to sell, in order to reap profit, and then you have to convince people that this is good. How to make it good? How to make a practice good, sound good and acceptable? Well, you have a philosophy to support it, and this philosophy that came to support it was utilitarianism, that you start telling people that they should work for utilitarian ends. They should always look at things from the utility angle. So if industrial goods are good, there in the market, then they are serving certain utilities, and the more goods are produced by the industry, the better the life quality of England be. I don't know whether that is directly true or not. Quality of life may in fact go down. I am in favor of industrialization and I am in favor of development, but I would say that industrialization in England was perceived as some kind of an evil in the early part of the 19th century and before, when things were moving towards industrialization. And in fact, Romantic movement, which I have been talking about, Romantic movement was a kind of reaction to industrialism, to industrialization in the country, because the landscape was changing fast in Europe at that time. With big industries, there was pollution, there were slums in the cities, there was enormous growth of the cities, the countryside was being devastated, and industrialism wouldn't bother about devastation at all at that time. Their job, the job of the people who were active in the industry as owners, their job only was to expand industrially, create markets, sell things and reap profits. Now this entire thing together is utilitarianism, and therefore they had people who would argue on their behalf and would tell them that this was the best thing possible in the circumstances, and that this was taking the society forward. It was taking the society forward in a certain manner. there would be now more production, and there will be greater facilities for the people coming through industrial production. At the same time, there will be a big harm done to ecology. There will be a big harm done to the grit and the tenacity of the village. In fact, the village will become more and more a term of abuse, a term of ridicule in the 19th century onwards. And a person who has not been to the city has not actually become modern. So all these prejudices, etc., will be at that point of time put forward in the name of industrialization. And I am not sure whether the kind of industrialization that happened in England and Europe at that point of time was entirely 100% good. It has its drawbacks, and as I said, the Romantic movement brought them out quite clearly. So this person is appearing to us to be a mouthpiece of industrialism and utilitarianism, which means that he has no idea about truth. He is talking of truth at some points of time, at some points in the document, but he doesn't seem to understand the value of truth. So he is using truth only as a term, only as a word, and then he has to propagate the case against funding the Indian languages and promoting, in fact, favoring and promoting English. So that thing we have discussed. But then, what about writers outside Romanticism? What is their attitude towards utilitarianism, which this person seems to be propagating indirectly? Well, you have at least one example, that is of Dickens writing a novel called Hard Times, in which he is bringing in the aspect of utilitarianism and showing its drawbacks. And Dickens is not a romantic writer. Dickens is a realistic fiction writer, a realistic novelist, and he tells us how the best elements in human life and experience are stand threatened by industrialism and utilitarianism. So there is a 19th century protest of the kind that one has not seen elsewhere, and that is coming from England itself, and by as great a writer as Dickens, who in the 19th century is a towering literary figure. So this person is writing a novel called Hard Times, and in Hard Times he is critiquing this. So in fact, friends, I will suggest to you, all of you, most of you are students of literature, when you read this document, keep in mind the message that Dickens seems to put across in the novel called Hard Times, and then you will see that this person is a spokesperson. He is a mouthpiece of utilitarianism. Is that the case? I am saying that is the case, but then you can form your own opinion and stick to it to the extent it appeals to you. The third question I raise for myself and for you is whether he is a victim also of bureaucratism. He is a bureaucrat. He is a person who enjoys arguing with people, and he is a debater, and he knows as I said earlier, he knows which point to suppress and which other point to emphasize. So he is talking like a bureaucrat. Now, what is the nature of a bureaucrat in general? Now, I am not denigrating any particular profession, but let me tell you that there are certain features of social practice, and a person who is a bureaucrat is supposed to carry out orders from elsewhere, and a person who has to facilitate the implementation of the policies. It's a very important job. If one doesn't have bureaucrats, if society does not have bureaucrats, then nothing gets done. This is true. But then the task that is assigned to a bureaucrat is a task which is not self-critical, and there is no room for doubt for a bureaucrat. The bureaucrat has to succeed, the bureaucrat has to carry out, the bureaucrat has to convince the other person, and otherwise one will not be a successful bureaucrat. So this person, his document is going to be prejudiced, because it has the prejudice of the policy that will work behind a certain principle. So he is not given to any kind of self-doubt. But if we are discussing themes such as emergence of a language, if we are discussing themes of literature, if we are discussing themes of science, scientific thought, then one has to have self-doubt. Self-doubt is self-questioning. Self-questioning brings in modesty. Modesty makes us more and more truthful. But if a person is a bureaucrat, as a bureaucrat, I am saying, every bureaucrat also is a human being. Every bureaucrat also is a citizen, and not in the field of bureaucracy, but outside it. A bureaucrat is a person, who is a father, who is a son, when one is trying, or a daughter today, who is thinking of adopting the career of a bureaucrat. But then when one is behaving as a bureaucrat, so is this person, Macaulay, a kind of a bureaucrat who has perhaps got some link from some policy hints from somewhere, that he has to prove a case against Orientalism. Then he comes forward, he argues, he's having that bombast, he's having those long sentences, and he's presenting a longish document, and finally he proves that we should support English language. Now imagine so much of bombast, and at the end he has to just fund English language now and open English schools. Opening English schools is fine, and India was not badly served by the introduction of English in the 19th century. We don't want to go into that question. But what I am saying is that his job has been done. He was able to prove, that all Indian languages were bad, wrong, that they didn't have anything, and that Indians would not serve any purpose for their own selves by adopting their own languages, and then their job was to learn English and then raise their level of consciousness. This was his purpose, and he has unto himself he has succeeded in making that point, and he succeeded so much in making that point that it became a policy document, and he was able to convince, he was able to influence British policy making. And the consequences of the policy that was adopted in the 19th century, those consequences are quite clear for all of us. They emerged in the 19th century, and they strengthened also in the 20th century. But all of us know that between Macaulay and between 47, there is a long gap of more than 100 years, 120 years or so. And in those 120 years, India was not marked by utilitarianism or by success of this or that language. It was marked by a resistance to the British policies. And actually, with the advent of English in India in 1836 or 1840, and balance shifting from one side to the other, we realized that from 1870 onwards up to 1947, we don't have emphasis on English in India. In fact, people who are educated in English and England, people like Gandhi and Nehru, these people are not adopting English, for their political work, and it is that which is the determining part of Indian culture. They are in fact taking to Indian languages. Gandhiji is talking in Indian languages. Nehru is talking in Indian languages in his campaigns, political campaigns, which means that one way or the other, these people were products of English culture and English thought, both Gandhiji and Nehru. At the same time, they were working for the good of India at that point of time, and language policy did not wrongly or rightly follow the requirements of the British regime. They wanted to have a class, and that class also played its role. And today the same class which this person is boasting about creating, the same class is critical of a large number of things that India is doing today, which means that but this person has done his job. So I asked this question, and then I answer it myself. Yes, there is a kind of bureaucratic bias in him, because of which this document cannot be taken at face value. Now the last point, and with this I finish. The last point is he a carrier of imperialist thought? What is imperialist thought? The imperialist thought is that the force of the empire, the center of empire is elsewhere, and that the person who lives at a place where the empire is determining the policies from distance, that is called imperialism. So you have an imperialist center elsewhere, let's say in England, and of that empire, India is a part, as an extension, as a colony. Well, in any case, I don't want to go into the definitions of colony and unit or extension of an empire, because they are slightly different in their nature. But I would say that imperialism as such, which has a strong economic connect, that had not yet emerged in India in the 19th century. It emerged in Europe also much later. But then this person seems to be a voice of imperialism in 1835. Economically speaking, imperialism sets in at the world level, on the scale of the world, somewhere in the 1890s. Yes, that's right, 1890s. Before that, you have colonialism. You have the center outside, and you have colonies elsewhere. But the economy is not as directly integrated between the colony and the colonial power. Economy gets integrated only when the colonial process or economic things take the shape of the economic net, and that economic net removes the boundaries between the colony and the original thing, and the whole thing becomes an empire, directly speaking. So we have the presence of the industry from outside also in India, and that happens in the towards the end of the 19th century. But this person is framing policies in England, and for the benefit of the Englishman, and the framing of the policies will be executed here. Those framed policies will be executed here for the benefit of the British economic interests. So I would say that as an economic exploiter, as an economic oppressor, as a person who is going to impose the economic structure from outside here, this person is using that method and technique of rhetoric and the idea of suppressing a whole nation from the point of view of imperialism. So I would say that this person is a carrier of imperialist thought in that sense, that Indians are supposed to be used as agents, used to as people who will be subjected to the logic of somebody else. The logic will not be the Indians of the Indian life. The logic will come from elsewhere. But then India will be experimented with, and he is doing it very easily. He will bring in English. He'll have a kind of social engineering. There will be a class here that class will think like English, and that will work for the betterment of the English interests. So this is what the person imagining, and whether he succeeds or not is a different thing. But then he seems to be a person who is carrying out the task assigned to him by imperialist interests. So I repeat these 4 questions, and I seek your answers. Please think about it. Is he reacting to utilitarianism? Sorry, is he reacting to Orientalism? Is he a voice of utilitarianism? Is he behaving as a bureaucrat? Is he voicing the interests of imperialism? These are the 4 questions I am raising, and my answer is that all these things seem to be true in the case of Macaulay in general and Macaulay's Minute in particular. But then he has started a debate, and he has started a process, and that process lasted for a long time, and in fact some consequences of that process still are there, but then the whole thing seems to be reverted now. That which was supposed to be serving English interests may not be serving those English interests today. We saw in the national movement and later that India became a strong nation, and India fought the British interests successfully, became free, and then became a strong nation. And India becomes that in spite of what Macaulay would have thought in his Minute. So with these comments, I finally, if yours, take leave, and I give the word to our anchor that this is how perhaps a document, in my opinion, could be interpreted. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much, and we believe that you might have got a lot through this particular lecture. So, dear friends, if you have any kind of query, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would love to have your suggestions as well as questions, and we love to solve your queries the next time when Professor Anand Prakash visits our studio. So, keep watching us and keep writing to us. We would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.